The first grey light of morning had only just fallen on the slopes south of Ishikawa, and the air still held the scorched powder and mud stink of the night's shelling. The front line was no longer a front line, but a hollowed-out strip of broken earth. Nakagawa Hiroshi couldn't pull himself free from the collapsed dugout. His right leg was pinned fast beneath a snapped support beam, the blood inside his uniform long since gone cold. In his ears there still lingered the sounds of metal tearing through air all night long, shell caps spinning off, fragments hitting ground, bolts sliding in gun actions, each metal sound engraved by training into a single judgment: danger is closing in. The 382nd Infantry Regiment's search team hadn't yet seen him, but he heard them first, the rhythm of boots folding wet mud underfoot, steady in ranks, utterly unstarved. No shouting, no confusion. In stark contrast to his own unit, there only hunger remained, spent ammunition and bare-handed resistance. He hadn't eaten all night. His throat held only the taste of blood and wet earth. His awareness pulled back and forth between exhaustion and survival instinct. The moment he saw a beam of light sweep across the side of his face, he reacted faster than his thoughts. He snatched up a chunk of muddy stone beside him and hurled it at the light, hearing a dull thud and the bright metallic ring of it striking a helmet brim. He tried to use that moment to wrench himself free, but 3 hands pressed down on his shoulders and chest at once. When the wood tore his wound open, the searing pain shot up his leg. He turned that pain into a second act of resistance, deliberately rolling his body toward the injured side, forcing the enemy to step back from the blood. But the pressure didn't withdraw. It only multiplied into more hands. When they rolled him onto his back, he saw unfamiliar patches sewn onto their uniforms. He had no time to distinguish them. He simply bared his teeth at the American boot braced near his shoulder and bit down. Muddy water flew in all directions. The Americans shouted quietly, but inflicted no violence. They merely wrenched his jaw open with practiced ease. His chest was pinned, his left arm locked. Somewhere off to the side, a bolt slid back. Metal clicking cleanly against metal, cold and crisp, like a verdict ratcheting tighter by degrees. In that instant he waited for an ending: bayonet, rifle butt, detonation, any of them more straightforward than being taken alive. But none of those came. Instead there was another metallic sound, carrying no threat, yet sharper and cleaner than any before it. Click. The air seemed to split. Nakagawa Hiroshi reflexively tensed every muscle, certain a second rifle was being cocked. But when his gaze jerked sideways, what he saw was not a weapon, but a small, steady flame burning against a metal case in the wind. The American holding that silver little box brought the flame gently to the bottom of an enamel mug. The fire didn't waver, as if stitching this chaotic battlefield to some entirely different order. In that single second, his resistance faltered. Not because his strength had been completely broken, but because, for the first time, he wasn't sure. Did that metallic sound come from a will to kill, or from a kind of steady, unhurried flame that had no place in war? When they half dragged, half carried him out of the cave-in, the wind over the slope still carried dust, like fine powder. It hung in the air like leftover shards of night, clinging to his face and eyelids, turning his field of vision into a constant grey haze. The hands on his shoulders and arms weren't rough, but so firm there were no gaps, as if they were transporting him as something that needed to be tagged and processed rather than an enemy soldier still struggling. The mud underfoot grew tacky and deep where the boots lifted and fell. From the sound alone, he knew the soles had deeper tread than the Japanese standard issue, harder and cleaner, producing short, clear scrapes whenever they stepped on stone. The holding area wasn't far. Between 2 low, rounded hills, a temporary ring of barbed wire caught tiny glints of light in the morning sun. The guy wires between the posts were still damp, as if freshly soaked in dew or recently tightened during the night. A small numbered flag stood by a stake at the entrance, not a banner for show, but something closer to a position marker, like those used at loading depots. The moment they carried him through, Nakagawa Hiroshi understood this wasn't an interrogation room, nor a makeshift lockup. It was something much more like a processing zone, a place meant to sort prisoners, wounded, and stragglers into standard categories. The ground was tamped hard, the kind of hardness formed by countless boots passing over it. Inside the wire, the space was divided into 3 strips: intake, medical tent, holding area. People moved in each one, their steps steady, neither hurried nor slow. The rhythm was completely different from the Japanese camps he knew. There, men were either running or rigidly motionless, either waiting for orders or scrambling to make up for shortages. Here, everyone seemed to know what they should be doing and when. Even when prisoners arrived, it only made the column bend slightly, like a stream flowing around a stone. Just as they crossed the bare patch before the medical tent, he heard that metallic sound again. Click. This time, there was no ambush, no clash at all, yet the muscles along his back still tightened involuntarily. With his shoulders pinned, he couldn't raise his upper body, only turn his head a little. The medic was snapping open that same silver box, his movements light and sure, with the ease of long practice. The lid popped up with a quick, sharp report that seemed to hammer the air into a thin sheet. A second later, a flame blossomed silently, pressed close to the inner wall of metal, holding steady in the wind as if in quiet defiance. The flame was passed under an enamel mug. A ring of fine, dark red appeared across its base. The water along the sides began to tremble almost imperceptibly, as if waking. They laid him on a slightly inclined plank, and someone began examining his leg. The pressure of fingers on skin and muscle was exact, like checking the damage on a piece of equipment rather than testing his pain. He had no strength left to fight, but his body still imitated resistance. His shoulders tensed on their own, his breathing turned short. He couldn't control those reactions any more than he could control the combat alert that surged up whenever he heard metal. Someone set the freshly heated mug on a flat rock by his side. Ceramic touched stone with the faintest tap. The medic took out a glass thermometer, a trace of condensation from the last prisoner still beading its tip. The droplet was blotted away with a tissue. Then the thermometer slipped into the mug, where that same flame began to warm it gently. The firelight drew a thin, bright line down the glass, as if inscribing some kind of order into the transparent stem. The way Nakagawa Hiroshi watched that flame was like watching a phenomenon that contradicted everything he knew. Since joining the army, the fires he'd seen were either feeble kitchen flames barely kept alive, dangerous signals revealing positions, or luxuries that had to be snuffed out when fuel ran low. Fire meant risk, depletion, exposure, not medicine, cleanliness, or order. Yet here, inside barbed wire, this flame was casually raised, lowered, and raised again, like a tool that no one needed to ration. His third reaction came more abruptly. He tried to push himself up off the board, levering his weight on one elbow, but he was too weak, and the board only creaked. His fingertips brushed the end of the thermometer and sent it trembling twice, the glass chiming faintly. He tried to grab it, but they pinned his wrist. In that failed grasp, his body reflexively rolled to the side, even at the cost of tearing his leg wound open again. He wasn't trying to escape. It was an animal error of survival. Faced with flame, faced with metal sounds, the body automatically looked for any direction that might lead away from danger. The medic pressing him down didn't increase his force or bark any orders. He simply took a tissue in his free hand and pressed it against the hollow between Hiroshi's shoulder and collarbone, keeping one sudden shiver from scraping his skin raw. The tissue's softness caught him off guard. It was the first touch in months that carried neither hostility nor command. It didn't relax him. Instead, it made his nervous system hesitate. Should he keep fighting or stop? The flame was snuffed out. The medic closed the metal case softly. The light vanished cleanly, and the click of the lid echoed in the air. Click. That sound made Nakagawa think a chamber was being loaded again. But there was no follow-up, no other movement at all. The metallic ring drifted through the air, like the dust on his face, utterly devoid of intent to kill. The thermometer was tucked into his armpit, a cotton towel draped over his shoulders in one smooth, unbroken gesture. He felt a strand of warmth through the cloth, not from the flame itself, but from the water that had just been heated. The same water poured over the towel, leaving it faintly steaming. In his mind, a prisoner's lot should mean interrogation, rough handling, humiliation. Yet this towel settled over him in a way that felt eerily procedural. Not like charity. Not far away, the Zippo snapped again. Click. This time, he didn't jerk. His body tightened a little, but there was no lunge, no wrenching struggle, no clamped jaw. For the first time, he became aware that the sound might not be followed by harm, and that realization itself was harder to endure than any pain. On that morning inside the barbed wire, a flame was lit and extinguished again and again, like a narrow thread, sewing together the orders of two completely different worlds. The line through the holding area kept moving. Under the strengthening sun, the shadows cast by the wire grew shorter. The tent canvas rippled in a broad curve when the wind hit it with a soft flap. Nakagawa Hiroshi was propped up again, half reclining against a slanted plank by a post, his vision no longer limited to bare earth. For the first time, he could see the workings of this place as a whole. Prisoners weren't bunched in a single corner, but divided across 3 routes and processed separately, as if every individual were a component that had to be checked item by item before being fed into a larger, uniform system. To the left of the medical tent stood a wooden table, the surface wiped clean, rough but free of blood or mud stains. On a metal tray lay folded tissues, ranks of glass thermometers, several still warm towels, and a wide-mouthed clear bottle whose alcohol glittered with an icy brightness. An open wooden crate beside it held rolled bandages and marked tins. The quantity wasn't extravagant, but there was a calm assurance that nothing would suddenly run out. It was hard to fit these objects into the same picture as the past few months of his life. There, matches had to be snuffed halfway. Bandages were scrubbed and dried and used again. Towels were distributed in half pieces, even quarter pieces. Body temperature wasn't measured with instruments, but guessed at by veteran fingers on necks and foreheads. Off the mark or not, it still had to be counted as fit to fight. Here, every item had a clear use and rhythm, appearing only when needed, then passed along, put away, or replaced. For that very reason, the second click of a Zippo stood out so sharply. Click. The metal lid sprang up, flame flared, and the light brushed across the medic's hand. The fine hairs on his skin stood out clearly in the glow. His motions didn't falter, as if this flame were just one more step in an inevitable sequence. He tilted the mug, keeping the fire close to its base until the temperature was right, then set it down and used the warmed water to soak a clean tissue, wiping sweat and dirt from another prisoner's face. In a short span of time, the Zippo's flame had appeared twice in Hiroshi's view, once as a surprise, once as part of a pattern. The first time it felt like a threat, the second clearly a standard step. He suddenly understood. That crisp, metallic click wasn't meant to trigger anything so much as signal a beginning, like a factory bell, a drill call, or some neutral alert sound. Again, they helped him change position, this time not by pinning him, but by half supporting, half dragging him toward a patch of shadow in the holding area. Sunlight speared through a slit in the tent roof, laying a jagged strip of brightness across the ground. Now and then the firelight flicked over that strip, the Zippo, turning idly in a medic's palm as he walked. The glow wasn't meant to illuminate anyone. It merely traced the movement of a tool through space. His mind grew clear enough to track small details. For once, pain wasn't his only anchor. He found himself caught by the alien beat of this place. He saw a GI drop his Zippo onto the ground, the case ringing hollowly against stone, light as if the object didn't matter much at all. The soldier bent down, picked it up, slapped off the dirt, and went on using it to kindle a scrap of paper, holding it up to illuminate a suture on another prisoner's wound. Drop, pick up, carry on. No inspection, no sense of loss. In his world, a source of flame was precious. Even poor-quality matches were broken to make 2 lights from 1. A rainstorm could spoil an entire box. Alcohol was so scarce that every drop had to be divided among several wounded men. But here, this tiny metal case could be dropped, picked up, and flicked open without a second thought. No worry about waste, no thought of hiding the flame. Fire seemed to be something taken for granted. He couldn't yet form a complete explanation, but a growing unease spread through him, a kind not born from hostility, but from the simple fact of resource without lack. It was like a man who had learned to survive by bailing water from the seams of a sinking ship, suddenly finding himself on a hull that did not leak at all, not rescued,
but forced to realize that every habit he'd relied on no longer applied. The moving column edged closer to the sorting table. Behind it, a clerk held a sheaf of forms, the rows of boxes rustling softly in the breeze. Each man brought forward was briefly checked for temperature and assigned a number, then directed to one of several zones, fit for labor, requiring rest, or needing transfer. It was clear this wasn't about mining them for information. It was about entering each man's condition into a system. Within minutes, every prisoner turned into a slot on a shelf, a node in a process. Nakagawa Hiroshi realized he was about to be pushed into that same node. His body tried once more to signal resistance, arms twitching, fingers clenching as if to grab something and drag his path aside. But the direction was no longer his to decide. The hands on his shoulders moved, the mud under his feet shifted, the flame in the air moved, the gleaming forms moved, only the rhythm of the metallic clicks stayed the same. Click, one ignition, click, one extinguishing. The intervals were almost identical, like beats in a ritual measure. Within that pattern, his sense of dissonance shifted, from physical discomfort to structural irreversibility. What made this irreversibility so suffocating wasn't brute force, but stability. Steady flames, steady supplies, steady procedures, steady handling. Even amid the wreckage of battle, the Americans kept this stability, while his world had begun to splinter months ago. The weight of that stability pressed his breathing shallow, but he could not fight it, because it wasn't a force aimed at him. It was a machinery that didn't need his existence to run. He heard thermometers being lifted, mugs set down, flame flaring again, and none of it paused on his account. He was nudged the last step before the sorting table, and for the first time the Zippo's glow in his eyes was neither threat nor accident, but a calm, quiet light that had nothing to do with him. The shadow in front of the sorting table shrank. Light on the tent roof shifted from slanting to vertical. The air carried the faint hot metal scent of sun-warmed wire, the sting of disinfectant, the damp smell of trodden earth. Half propped on his board, Hiroshi sat slumped, sweat and mud tracing a darker line down from his jaw. He barely noticed when the line had carried him to the front. Only the sounds around him had grown thicker and more uniform. The clerk behind the table occasionally tapped his clipboard with a pencil, short, quick taps that braided with the Zippo's clicks into an odd rhythm. The pencil strike was muffled by the humidity in the paper, while the lighter's metal clack stayed sharp and clean, slicing through the dusty air like a drawn line. Each time that line sounded, the muscles along Hiroshi's spine drew tight, less with the urge to jump than from a nervous system that no longer knew where to anchor itself. When his turn came, the medic told him to stay seated, leaning as he was. No commands, no reprimands, just a matter-of-fact assumption that this was where he belonged. He heard the Zippo flick open for the third time in quick succession. Click. The flame rose, the medic tilting the mug so that a trickle of hot water slid down its inner wall into a shallow basin. A towel soaked for a few seconds, then was lifted out, steaming evenly. The fire clung to the edges of ceramic and metal, turning the whole sequence into a practiced routine, nowhere rushed. When the towel settled over his shoulders, he hesitated. The warmth was mild, but enough to seep through damp cloth into his skin. Instinct told him to knock it away, a reflex drilled into him for months. Any contact, any offered item had to be doubted, guarded against, rejected, leaving a gap for a last lunge or counterattack. But this time, his fingers stalled in the air, not from obedience, but because the heat and damp from the towel echoed almost eerily, a brief respite he dimly remembered from a convalescent station far in the rear. That had been so long ago, he wasn't even sure it had truly happened. Someone held his elbow and slid the thermometer back under his arm. The cool glass against his skin and the warmth on his shoulders cancelled each other out, settling into a strange equilibrium. He couldn't help looking up. On the table lay 3 Zippos, their shine slightly different, some brighter, some dulled by handling, but all bearing the look of things used many times. They weren't on display, they were simply lying where someone had put them down, ready to be picked up again.
That casualness made something twist in his chest. Not anger, not fear, but a deep misalignment. Like being thrown from cracked earth onto a smooth, endlessly sloping surface where no matter how he reached, there was nothing to grab hold of to stop the slide. The lighter snapped open again just as the clerk glanced at him. The flame cast an angled glow across the board, sharpening the outlines of mug, thermometer, and paper. The clerk's movements were stripped to essentials. A glance at Hiroshi's face, a glance at the wound, a glance at the reading. The faint scratch of pencil on paper sounded like a confirmation repeated 1,000 times over. No questions, no probing. Here his statement seemed unnecessary, his intent was irrelevant. The standard lay in the boxes on the form. A man's condition needed only to drop into the proper square. To him, this was stranger than interrogation. Training had taught him, if you're captured and want to live, you must make the enemy believe you're still of use. He'd been told that captivity was not an ending, but another form of deployment. You had to keep information uncertain, forcing the enemy to keep asking, keep testing, and survive in the gaps. But here, there were no tests. No one asked his unit, his birthplace, his rank, not even insisted he repeat his name, that all occupied a single small rectangle at the top of the form. For the first time he understood. In this system, his value was not the starting point. Whether he lied, cooperated, or seemed useful would not alter the process. It did not revolve around him, did not require him. He was only one node, to be received, evaluated, placed, then sent onward. That realization unsettled his breathing more than any weapon or threat. The flame rose once more. Click! He couldn't stop himself from lifting his head just slightly, as if he needed one more look at it. Still steady, still unquenched by the wind, still struck a light at will without hesitation. He could no longer read from it any hint of the tension of war, the desperation of dwindling supplies, or the risk of annihilation. What it signaled was not one soldier's power, but a foundation he lacked, a base that kept the entire structure from collapsing. It was the first time he sensed true danger, but not to his life. It spread from the core of him outward, a threat to his entire way of understanding. It forced him toward one admission. Every method of judgment he had relied on failed here. When they took the thermometer away, he did nothing to resist, only sluggishly followed the medic's guiding hands. The clerk wrote his temperature into a box with a quiet, decisive stroke. He had become a number, a category, a state to be pushed along. The flame flared again. This time he did not look. Yet when the metal snap reached his ears, a new fear eased open inside him. A fear not fully formed, but already steering the rest of his path. A fear deeper than defeat in battle. The enemy does not need you and does not center you. The Zippo's repeated fire was the clearest proof of that. By afternoon, the wind had shifted, blowing damp sea air over the low hills, salt spreading through the holding area. The tent canvas puffed out and fell flat with each gust, like breath filling some vast unseen lung. Sunlight now slanted from higher up, throwing the wire's shadow into a skewed grid across the ground and over every body placed within. Those shadows slid constantly, as if the entire camp were being carried along by an invisible engine while each person merely went with it. They moved him to a different strip of shade near the sorting line. His wound had been roughly treated, but left unbandaged. The warmth of the towel faded from his shoulders, the tissue between his fingers dried to brittleness. Out of habit, he scanned every detail around him, searching for clues to explain what he was in the middle of. That habit came from training, and from long practice at surviving in chaos. But everything around him radiated an order he had no words for, not the stiff severity of parade ground discipline, nor the frantic patchwork of scarcity, but an ease that needed neither constant tension nor ruthless squeezing. Gradually he realized that very ease was a structure, a form of strength, and he stood outside it. When the third medical lane reopened, he noticed a small thing. A medic knocked the mouth of an alcohol bottle against the basin rim with a clear ting. It wasn't clumsiness, it was the unruffled gesture of someone not afraid of waste. The liquid inside shimmered in the sun, a pale amber glow through the glass.
A few drops splashed out, but no one paused. No one showed regret. No one was reprimanded. The spill hissed briefly into the air and vanished. On Japanese positions, alcohol meant competition among the wounded. He had seen two lightly injured men argue over a little diluted disinfectant, their knuckles white as if they were clawing for their last chance at survival. Here, alcohol behaved like water, allowed to spill, drip, be used without guilt. That gap needed no explanation. It cut straight past his reasoning, striking some hidden inner chord. For the first time, he clearly knew. If resources here were wasted, it was not out of carelessness, but because there was that much to spare. Another Zippo snapped open. Click. Only then did he realize it wasn't the same man using it. At least 3 medics carried Zippos. Their timing differed, their gestures aligned. The fire source was not a private trinket, but an agreed standard fixture of the medical line. Together they traced an ongoing pattern of flame in the air, igniting, dying, like the breathing of the area itself. Everything he had believed about fire, scarcity, danger, exposure, self-consumption, came apart. When the wind gusted, he instinctively thought the flame would go out, but it held, only leaning to one side, as though some unseen shell shielded it. He didn't know why the metal case had that ability, or how the flame resisted the wind. He only knew this. It belonged to a system backed by enormous support, not some last-minute improvisation at the front. All at once, a thought crystallized. The stability of that flame meant their entire way of making war was not the same as his. His stomach clenched, not from pain or hunger, but from a deep, bottomless drop. At the edge of his vision, a supply convoy rolled by. Tires flung up dust, briefly dimming the light. Crates were stacked on the trucks, black lettering on their sides, not a single box broken or listing. The gaps between them were carefully chalked, built for long travel. As they passed the medical tent, the drivers neither slowed for the prisoners nor hesitated at the mud. The engines hummed steadily, as if on a road laid down long before. In that moment, he understood. American supplies didn't reach the front. The front kept moving toward the supplies. They weren't struggling to catch up to their logistics. They advanced with their logistics already in tow. He could almost see it, a chain stretching from the sea. One end in the fleets, one in the trucks, the links never breaking. The flame was the smallest, clearest sign of that chain. The fire is constant. It doesn't go out. The supplies are constant. The motions don't falter. For the first time, a thought he couldn't accept took shape. They are not going to lose. Whatever happens to any given man, whatever the enemy's numbers, behind them stands a world that does not run dry. And Japan? He wouldn't let himself finish that thought. Pain stabbed his chest, not from the wound, but from a realization too heavy for his lungs. This was not the fear of interrogation, nor the panic of defeat in battle. It felt more like being surrounded and pressed in by reality itself. Down the third medical lane, the Zippo clicked a light yet again. Click. The flame brightened the tiny lines on a thermometer, the joints of the medic's fingers, and the eyes of the man watching. For the first time, Nakagawa turned his gaze away, not out of fear, but because inside that fire lay an answer he could not bear, an answer not yet fully formed, already enough to loosen what he thought he knew. He began to feel that resistance no longer meant anything. More precisely, he began to doubt whether he still belonged to the category of those who resist at all. The flame rose once more and once more, held steady in the wind. Dust seemed lodged in his throat, even swallowing grew difficult. By sunset, the barbed wire's shadow had stretched thin, a row of dark strands tugged by the wind. The holding area fell quiet. Only pages turning, crates thumping down, buckles chiming, faintly broke the hush. They moved him to a spot near the exit where a few other prisoners coughed softly or dozed from exhaustion. The air cooled, his shoulders hunched reflexively. The towel over him had gone cold, but still lay there, like a step some process had forgotten to remove. Just as he thought the coming night might grant him a little breathing room, his awareness surged back through him in a rush. In the hours behind him, his world had been peeled back layer by layer. Now only the most fragile shell remained. That thin shell was harder to bear than hunger, than wounds, than the sight of a muzzle. That shell was the realization, for the first time, that for Japan the war was no longer a desperate counterattack, but an irreversible end. His body's reflex fired again. He suddenly strained upward, trying to tear free from the fixed path his feet were meant to follow. His elbow scraped a rough post, leaving a streak of red. His knee carved a half arc through the mud, as if he meant to lunge for the wire, or to scramble away from some void larger than death. His chest burned, his breath was ripped out of him. Still his muscles fought. This time, however, there was no direction, no clear target. He wasn't fighting the Americans. He was fighting the truth that there would be no turning this back. When a medic approached, he didn't draw a gun or strike. He simply found a solid point beneath Hiroshi's shoulder and pressed, draining the momentum from his struggling in a few seconds. Another medic brought a fresh towel, still faintly warm, and laid it against his neck, as if to steady a racing pulse. Someone pushed a half cup of lukewarm water into his hand. The mild heat was enough to coax his breathing back into a rhythm. Then the familiar metal sound rang out once more. Click. A flame sprang up a few paces away, raised to light a temperature log. The glow lingered on the edge of the page, swaying gently, illuminating a chain of numbers yet to be filled in. The flame carried no threat and offered no test. It simply shone on the row where his line had already been written. In that box, his name, wound, temperature and destination were all recorded in the same hand as fit for transfer. As the light stroked that entry, the tightness in his chest seemed to dissolve into something blank and weightless. His resistance hadn't been beaten down. It had been absorbed, washed away by a stability that asked nothing of him. It wasn't mercy nor forgiveness. It was the bare fact that, from here on, you can go on living in order. Heat seeped slowly from towel to shoulder and back. He realized the chill in his body was receding. Another supply truck rolled past, its engine humming with a steady, untroubled breath. For the first time, he did not search that sound for threats or chances. He only felt himself being carried towards some new direction. When night fully fell, prisoners were assembled in groups. Dozens were marched toward a temporary road to the coast, to be sent next day to a POW camp in the Kerama Islands. The noises of planks, footsteps, and wire threads mixed softly together. There were no shouts, no barking orders. The column flowed forward like water. When they helped him to his feet, he no longer tried to twist free. His steps were light, as if testing whether the ground beneath him would once again give way. The wind passing through the wire set off a faint trembling, and the almost inaudible sound made him look back without thinking. A few meters away, the medic with the Zippo was blowing out its flame. A single tongue of light, then nothing. The metal lid dropped shut with one last short tap. Click. This time he did not hear it as a weapon, nor as a threat. It sounded like a battle being folded up and put away, sealed, while what came next would not be a continuation of fighting, but some kind of life that simply had to go on. He had no words for this understanding, but he knew that some part of him could never go back to the shape it had before. As he stepped forward into the darkness, something rose in his chest that did not belong to the battlefield. Not victory, not humiliation, but a simpler thought. The war is over, and he is still alive.